The fracture in the operating room. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the operating room, casting a sterile glow over the surgical team as they prepared for the morning's first procedure. At the head of the table stood Dr. Roger Whitman, a renowned surgeon whose reputation was as impeccable as his precision in the operating room, or so it seemed on the surface. His tall frame loomed over the operating table, his sharp blue eyes scanning the instruments like a hawk. The surgical team around him moved with practiced efficiency, though the tension in the room was palpable. Martha Carter, a seasoned nurse with over 15 years of experience, stepped into the room. Her presence commanded respect, not because she demanded it, but because her calm confidence and unparalleled skill naturally inspired it. Her dark skin stood out against the light blue scrubs she wore, and her voice carried the reassuring tone of someone who had weathered many storms in her profession. "I'm here to assist, Dr. Whitman," Martha said, her voice steady and professional. She was covering for a colleague who had fallen ill and had been called in as a last-minute replacement. Roger glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't reply, simply gesturing for her to take her place. For most, his dismissive manner would have gone unnoticed, but Martha caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way his jaw tightened and his shoulders stiffened. She had seen this reaction before. It was a reaction born not from professional concerns, but from something deeper, more insidious. The surgery began, and the team fell into their practiced rhythm. Martha moved seamlessly, her years of experience evident in the way she anticipated every need. But her presence seemed to unsettle Roger. His commands, usually delivered with calm authority, were now curt and sharp. "Clamp," Roger barked, holding out his hand. Martha, ever efficient, picked up the required tool and handed it to him. As she leaned in, her elbow accidentally brushed against his arm. The contact was fleeting, barely noticeable, but Roger recoiled as if burned. His blue eyes flashed with anger, and he snapped, "Watch what you're doing. I don't need you contaminating the sterile field. Stay back." The room fell silent, the tension hanging like a thick fog. The other nurses exchanged glances but said nothing. Martha paused, her hand steady despite the sting of his words. She took a step back, her expression neutral. "Yes, doctor," she replied, her tone even but firm. The surgery continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Roger's commands became sharper, his tone more condescending. Martha maintained her professionalism, focusing on the patient and ignoring the growing weight of Roger's disdain. She had faced prejudice before. This was not new territory for her, but the setting made it more painful. A hospital, a place meant to heal, felt tainted by the venom of Roger's behavior. As the operation progressed, Roger's frustration seemed to build. At one point, when Martha handed him an instrument, he purposely ignored her and reached for it himself, muttering under his breath. His arrogance was not lost on the rest of the team, but no one dared to intervene. The patient's vitals remained stable, and the surgery concluded without complications. Yet the tension in the room lingered long after the final stitch was placed. As the team began cleaning up, Roger addressed the group, his voice dripping with false authority. "Next time, ensure the staff assigned to my surgeries are better prepared. I won't tolerate distractions." The comment, though veiled, was clearly directed at Martha. She met his gaze evenly, her eyes calm but unyielding. "Understood, doctor," she replied, her voice steady. She would not allow him to see the impact of his words. Strength was her shield, and professionalism her weapon. As the team disbanded, Martha went to the nurse's station to complete her post-operative notes. Her hands moved mechanically over the keyboard, but her mind was elsewhere. The sting of Roger's behavior lingered, not because it was unique, but because it represented a deeper wound. A wound she had encountered many times before, but never allowed to define her. Later that afternoon, Martha found herself standing outside Roger's office. She knew she needed to address the situation, not just for her own dignity, but for the sake of future collaborations. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. "Come in," came Roger's voice, clipped and impatient. Martha stepped inside, her posture straight and composed. Roger barely looked up from the papers on his desk. The room was impeccably organized, every detail screaming control and precision, a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions bubbling beneath the surface. "Dr. Whitman," Martha began, her voice calm but firm, "I wanted to discuss what happened in the operating room earlier. If there was an issue with my performance, I'd appreciate the opportunity to address it." Roger finally looked up, his eyes cold and dismissive. "There's nothing to discuss, Nurse Carter. You were out of line, and I expect better adherence to protocol in the future." Martha's heart clenched, but she refused to let her composure falter. "I followed every protocol to the letter, Doctor. If you feel otherwise, I'd like to understand where I went wrong." Roger leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. "You're overstepping, Nurse. It's not your place to question my judgment. Just do your job and stay out of my way." Martha took a slow breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "With all due respect, Doctor, professionalism and mutual respect are critical for effective teamwork in the operating room. I'm committed to providing the best care for our patients, and I expect the same from everyone on the team." Roger's expression darkened. He stood, towering over her, his presence meant to intimidate. "Let me make this clear, Nurse Carter," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You don't dictate how I run my surgeries. You're here to follow orders, not to question them. Is that understood?" Martha met his gaze, refusing to be cowed. "Crystal clear, Doctor," she replied, her voice unwavering. Without another word, she turned and left the office, her heart pounding but her head held high. She knew she had done the right thing, but the encounter left a bitter taste in her mouth. What neither Martha nor Roger realized was that someone had overheard their conversation. A janitor, quietly mopping the hallway, had paused when he heard the raised voices. He recognized Martha. Everyone in the hospital knew her as one of the most respected nurses on staff. And he recognized Roger's tone, a tone of entitlement and arrogance that often masked something far uglier. The janitor's hands tightened around the mop handle as he listened. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew one thing for certain: Martha deserved better, and so did the hospital that had unknowingly welcomed someone like Roger Whitman into its halls. The seeds of retribution. The sun cast long shadows over Memorial Hospital as Martha stepped out into the crisp evening air. Her encounter with Dr. Roger Whitman weighed heavily on her, but she wasn't the type to crumble under pressure. She had spent her entire career proving her worth through action, not argument. Yet this incident felt different. It wasn't just an insult to her. It was an affront to the integrity of the entire hospital. Martha got into her car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her cheek still stung from the earlier slap, and though her pride hurt more, she resolved not to let it show. She reminded herself that anger was only useful if channeled correctly. With a deep breath, she started the engine and drove home. Her husband, Daniel Carter, was already in the kitchen when she arrived. A tall, imposing man with a commanding presence, Daniel was both a successful businessman and the co-owner of Memorial Hospital. While his demeanor in business meetings could be intimidating, his face softened the moment he saw Martha walk through the door. "You're home late," he said, concern flickering in his eyes as he noticed the tension in her posture. Martha hesitated for a moment, considering whether to tell him everything. She knew Daniel's protective instincts ran deep, and if she shared the details of her day, he wouldn't hesitate to take immediate action. But Martha also knew that a knee-jerk reaction wouldn't bring lasting change. She wanted justice, yes, but she wanted it to be meaningful. "I had a rough day," she said finally, setting her bag down on the counter. "Nothing I can't handle, though." Daniel raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to the story. He stepped closer, gently tilting her chin to examine her face more closely. His expression darkened as he noticed the faint redness on her cheek. "What happened?" Martha met his gaze, her resolve firm. "I'll tell you, but not yet. I need time to think about how to handle it." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He respected her strength and trusted her judgment. "All right," he said, his voice low and steady. "But if you need me, I'm here." Martha gave him a small smile, grateful for his support. "I know." The next morning, Martha arrived at the hospital with renewed purpose. She had spent much of the night considering her options and had come to a decision. Confrontation alone wouldn't suffice. She needed to ensure that Roger's actions were exposed in a way that would hold him accountable, not just for her sake, but for the sake of every staff member who might face his arrogance and prejudice in the future. She started her shift as usual, maintaining her professionalism despite the undercurrent of tension that had followed her since the incident. Word of her encounter with Roger had already begun to spread among the staff, though no one dared to speak openly about it. The hospital was a microcosm of unspoken rules, where hierarchy often dictated silence. As Martha made her rounds, she was approached by Ron, the janitor who had overheard her conversation with Roger the previous day. Ron was a quiet man, known for his diligence and unassuming nature, but today he seemed unusually hesitant. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low, "do you have a minute?" Martha nodded, stepping aside into a quiet corner. "What is it, Ron?" He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I saw what happened yesterday. In his office." He paused, his grip tightening on the mop handle. "I couldn't just stand by and say nothing. I heard how he spoke to you. I saw him hit you." Martha's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "You were there." Ron nodded. "And that's not all. After you left, he tried to pay me off to keep quiet." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, placing it in her hands. "There's $1,000 in there." Martha stared at the envelope, her mind racing. The confirmation of Roger's attempt to cover his tracks was both infuriating and validating. "Why are you telling me this?" Ron met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because it's wrong. What he did to you, what he stands for. It's not right. And people like him don't stop unless someone makes them." Martha felt a surge of gratitude toward Ron. It would have been easy for him to pocket the money and stay silent. But instead, he had chosen to do the right thing. "Thank you, Ron," she said sincerely. "This means a lot." Ron nodded, a hint of relief in his expression. "If you need me to back you up, I will. Just say the word." Martha placed a hand on his shoulder. "I appreciate that more than you know." Armed with the envelope and Ron's testimony, Martha knew she had the leverage she needed, but she also knew that simply reporting the incident wouldn't be enough. Roger was a man who thrived on his reputation, and she intended to dismantle it piece by piece. Later that day, Martha reached out to several other staff members who had worked with Roger since his arrival. She asked pointed but subtle questions about their experiences with him, carefully gauging their responses. It didn't take long to uncover a pattern. Roger's arrogance and condescension weren't limited to her. Several nurses and junior doctors admitted to being belittled or dismissed by him, though none had come forward out of fear of retaliation. Martha compiled their accounts, documenting everything with meticulous care. She knew the importance of presenting a clear and undeniable case. This wasn't just about holding Roger accountable. It was about protecting the hospital's culture of respect and collaboration. That evening, Martha finally shared the full story with Daniel. She recounted the events of the operating room, the confrontation in Roger's office, and Ron's revelation. As she spoke, Daniel's expression shifted from concern to anger. "This man has no place in our hospital," he said firmly. "We need to act now." Martha placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "We will, but we need to do it the right way. I've been gathering evidence, and I have witnesses willing to come forward. If we're going to confront him, we need to make sure there's no room for denial." Daniel nodded, his respect for his wife deepening. "What's your plan?" Martha's eyes gleamed with determination. "Tomorrow, I'm calling a meeting with the hospital board. It's time they learned exactly who Dr. Roger Whitman really is." The following morning, Martha entered the hospital with a sense of purpose. She had spent the night organizing her evidence, ensuring every detail was accounted for. The board meeting was scheduled for noon, and she intended to present her case with the same precision she brought to her nursing. As she passed through the hallways, she felt the weight of every staff member's eyes on her. Word had spread that something significant was happening, though no one knew the specifics. Martha kept her head high, her resolve unshaken. At noon, she entered the boardroom, her presence commanding attention. Seated at the table were the hospital's top administrators, including Daniel, who had insisted on attending in support of his wife. Roger was also present, his expression one of feigned indifference. "Thank you all for being here," Martha began, her voice steady and confident. "I've called this meeting to address a matter of great importance. It concerns the behavior of one of our senior staff members, Dr. Roger Whitman." Roger's smug demeanor faltered slightly, though he quickly recovered. "What is this about?" he asked, his tone dismissive. Martha met his gaze, unflinching. "It's about accountability, Dr. Whitman. And it's about ensuring that this hospital remains a place of respect and integrity." She began presenting her evidence, starting with the events in the operating room and the confrontation in his office. She detailed his condescending behavior, the physical assault, and the attempted bribe. With each point, she provided documentation and witness statements, leaving no room for doubt. By the time she finished, the room was silent. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Roger looked genuinely unsettled. "This isn't just about me," Martha concluded. "It's about the culture we want to foster in this hospital. A culture where every staff member is treated with respect, regardless of their position or background. Dr. Whitman's behavior is unacceptable, and it cannot be allowed to continue." The board members exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice firm. "Thank you, Martha. Your courage in bringing this to our attention is commendable. Dr. Whitman, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Roger opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled, and he knew he had no ground to stand on. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and there was no stopping them now. The storm builds. Roger's silence stretched uncomfortably in the boardroom. The hum of the air conditioning and the faint sound of papers rustling filled the void. His confident veneer had cracked, and everyone could see it. For the first time, his usual bravado failed him. Martha remained composed, though her heart raced. She had just laid out a case that could dismantle Roger's career, and the gravity of the moment was not lost on her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had endured his arrogance and condescension. Finally, Roger cleared his throat. His voice, usually commanding, wavered slightly. I don't know what you think you've proven here, Nurse Carter," he began, his words measured but lacking their usual bite. "It's clear there's been some misunderstanding. Perhaps emotions ran high during the procedure, but to suggest any malicious intent on my part is unfounded." Daniel's sharp glare cut through Roger's weak defense. "Misunderstanding," he repeated, his tone icy. "Dr. Whitman, are you denying the evidence presented? The accounts from staff members, the bribe you attempted to give Mr. Ron?" Roger hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an ally. Finding none, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm not denying there were tensions, but the claims about a bribe are baseless. That janitor, he must have misunderstood." Martha's voice cut through his deflection like a scalpel. "Misunderstood? Are you suggesting that handing someone an envelope full of cash and telling them to forget what they saw is ambiguous?" The room fell silent again. One of the board members, Dr. Evelyn Sanchez, leaned forward, her expression stern. "Dr. Whitman, this is a serious accusation. Attempting to silence a witness with a bribe is not only unethical, but could have legal consequences. I'd advise you to choose your next words carefully." Roger's face flushed, the weight of the room pressing down on him. For years, his reputation had been his shield. Patients adored him, administrators respected him, and his peers feared crossing him. But now, with his back against the wall, that shield was beginning to crack. Meanwhile, the hospital buzzed with rumors. News of the board meeting had spread like wildfire among the staff. Nurses whispered in break rooms, junior doctors exchanged knowing glances, and even the cafeteria workers seemed unusually subdued. Martha's confrontation with Roger had struck a chord with many. For years, his arrogance had gone unchecked, and his treatment of staff members, particularly those he deemed beneath him, had created a culture of fear and resentment. In the staff lounge, Ron sat nervously, sipping a cup of coffee. A few nurses approached him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and encouragement. "Ron," one of them said, her voice low, "is it true? Did you really see what happened with Dr. Whitman?" Ron hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the door, as if expecting Roger to burst in at any moment. "Yeah," he admitted finally. "I saw everything. And I told Nurse Carter. She's standing up to him." The nurses exchanged glances, their respect for Martha evident. One of them, a younger nurse named Lily, spoke up. "It's about time someone did. He's been a nightmare to work with since day one." Another nurse, an older man named Frank, nodded. "She's brave, taking him on like this. But she's not alone. If she needs us, we'll back her up." Back in the boardroom, the meeting reached its boiling point. Daniel stood, his imposing presence dominating the room. This hospital was founded on principles of respect, equality, and excellence, he said, his voice firm. "Dr. Whitman, your actions, both in the operating room and afterward, violate everything we stand for. If even half of what has been presented today is true, then you have no place here." Roger's face twisted in anger. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his composure slipping further. "You're taking the word of a nurse and a janitor over mine. I've dedicated my life to this profession, and this is the thanks I get." Martha rose from her seat, her calm demeanor unwavering. "This isn't about seniority, Dr. Whitman," she said, her voice steady. "It's about accountability. Your actions don't just harm individuals, they undermine the trust and collaboration that are essential in a hospital. You don't get to treat people like tools and expect them to stay silent." Roger's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Dr. Sanchez spoke again. "Dr. Whitman, as a member of this board, I move that we conduct a formal review of your behavior and temporarily suspend your privileges until the investigation is complete." The other board members murmured their agreement, and Daniel nodded. "Seconded." Roger's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. My patients rely on me. This hospital relies on me." Martha met his gaze, her expression resolute. "The hospital will survive without your arrogance, Dr. Whitman. What it can't survive is the erosion of respect and integrity. Those are the foundations of care, and they matter more than any one person." As the meeting concluded, Roger stormed out of the room, his face a mask of fury. Martha watched him go, her shoulders heavy but her heart steady. She knew this was only the beginning. The suspension was a step in the right direction, but she also knew that true accountability required persistence. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "You handled that beautifully," he said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Martha offered him a small smile. "It's not over yet, but we're getting there." Later that evening, Martha returned to the hospital for her night shift. As she walked through the halls, she noticed something different. Staff members who usually averted their eyes or avoided confrontation now nodded at her, their expressions filled with admiration and gratitude. Word of her stand against Roger had inspired a quiet ripple of change. In the break room, Ron approached her hesitantly. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice low, "I just wanted to thank you for standing up to him, for all of us." Martha placed a hand on his arm, her expression kind. "Thank you, Ron. Your courage in coming forward made all the difference." As she returned to her rounds, Martha couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt winnable. The seeds of change had been planted, and she was determined to see them grow. In the shadows of the hospital, Roger nursed his bruised ego, plotting his next move. But Martha wasn't afraid. She knew that justice, though slow, was inevitable, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Shadows and consequences. The hospital seemed quieter than usual as the dust from the board meeting began to settle. Yet beneath the surface, the staff's whispers had turned into a steady hum. The story of Martha standing up to Dr. Roger Whitman had spread to every corner of Memorial Hospital, creating ripples of both admiration and trepidation. Some applauded her courage, while others feared the repercussions of challenging someone as influential as Roger. For Martha, the day had been a whirlwind. After hours of presenting evidence and answering questions from the board, she had hoped for a moment to breathe, but that luxury would have to wait. The hospital's halls were still buzzing with patients to treat, charts to update, and procedures to assist with. Roger's retreat. Roger Whitman, however, was not in the operating room. He sat alone in his office, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. The blinds were drawn, casting the room in dim light. The polished surfaces and certificates on the walls now seemed mocking, their shine dulled by the weight of his suspension. He slammed a hand down on the desk, sending a pen rolling to the floor. How had it come to this? He had always seen himself as untouchable, the star surgeon whose name carried clout. Now, his privileges were suspended, his reputation hanging by a thread. Roger leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with anger and paranoia. He knew the staff had never liked him, but he hadn't cared. Respect wasn't necessary, as long as they followed his orders. But this rebellion was different. It wasn't just defiance. It was a calculated attack. And it wasn't just the staff who had turned against him. The hospital board, the very people who had once praised his contributions, had suddenly shifted their tone. He suspected Daniel Carter's influence. Martha's husband, the co-owner of the hospital, had to be behind this. The thought of being outmaneuvered by a nurse and her connections made his blood boil. Roger's fingers hovered over his phone. He considered calling a lawyer, but he hesitated. Legal action might make him look desperate, weak. Instead, he decided he needed leverage, something to shift the balance of power back in his favor. Martha's quiet resolve. Meanwhile, Martha moved through her shift with the same grace and professionalism that had defined her career. Her interactions with patients were warm and attentive, her demeanor calm even when the workload became overwhelming. But beneath her composed exterior, she carried the weight of what had happened, and what was yet to come. During a brief lull in her duties, she sat down in the staff lounge, cradling a cup of tea. A few nurses approached her hesitantly, their admiration clear in their eyes. "Nurse Carter," one of them, Lily, began, "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did. A lot of us have been putting up with Dr. Whitman's behavior for too long. You've given us hope." Martha smiled softly. "Thank you, Lily. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. We deserve to work in a place where we're respected." Frank, the senior nurse, chimed in. "If you ever need us to back you up, we're here. You don't have to fight this alone." Martha nodded, gratitude swelling in her chest. "I appreciate that more than you know." The spark of defiance. Later that evening, Ron, the janitor, found himself once again lingering outside Roger's office. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint sound of a phone conversation drifted out. Ron hesitated, torn between minding his own business and satisfying his growing curiosity. But something about Roger's tone, a mix of anger and urgency, kept him rooted in place. "I don't care what it takes," Roger hissed into the phone. "Find something, anything, that can discredit her. I don't care how small it is. She wants to play hero. Let's see how she likes it when her little secrets come to light." Ron's stomach churned. It didn't take a genius to figure out who Roger was talking about. Clutching his cleaning supplies, he backed away from the door, his mind racing. He couldn't let Roger's scheming go unchecked. An unexpected ally. The next morning, Martha received an unexpected visitor. As she reviewed patient charts in the nurse's station, Dr. Evelyn Sanchez, one of the hospital board members, approached her. "Martha," Evelyn said, her tone warm but serious. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Dr. Sanchez." Martha set down her clipboard and gestured toward a quiet corner. Evelyn's sharp eyes softened as she leaned in. "I wanted to let you know that the board is taking your claims very seriously. We're conducting a full investigation, and we've already interviewed several staff members who corroborated your account." Martha felt a wave of relief, but Evelyn's expression quickly turned somber. "However," she continued, "I've heard whispers that Dr. Whitman isn't taking this lying down. He's been making calls, trying to dig up dirt on you. I wanted to warn you to be prepared." Martha's jaw tightened. She had expected resistance from Roger, but the idea of him prying into her life filled her with unease. "Thank you for letting me know," she said. "I'll handle it." Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on Martha's shoulder. "You're not alone in this. If you need support, don't hesitate to ask." Roger's desperation. That evening, Roger's frustration reached a boiling point. His efforts to find anything incriminating about Martha had yielded nothing. Her record was spotless, her reputation impeccable. The more he dug, the more his own flaws seemed to stand out in comparison. Seated in a dimly lit bar, Roger nursed a glass of whiskey, his mind clouded with bitterness. He had underestimated Martha, and now she was a step ahead. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. A message from an old colleague who owed him a favor. The text read, "Nothing on Martha, but I found something on her husband. Might be useful." Roger smirked, a glint of malice returning to his eyes. If he couldn't tarnish Martha directly, perhaps he could target the people around her. It wasn't ideal, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Martha's resolve strengthens. As the days passed, Martha remained vigilant. She knew Roger was still a threat, but she also knew she wasn't alone. The support from her colleagues and the board gave her strength, and her focus remained on doing her job to the best of her ability. One evening, as she walked to her car after a long shift, she found Ron waiting for her in the parking lot. His expression was anxious, but determined. "Miss Carter," he said, "I need to tell you something." Martha frowned. "What is it, Ron?" He glanced around nervously before speaking. "I overheard Dr. Whitman on the phone. He's trying to find something to use against you. I don't know what he's planning, but it sounded bad." Martha's eyes narrowed. "Thank you for telling me, Ron. I'll make sure he doesn't get away with it." As Ron nodded and walked away, Martha stood in the dim light of the parking lot, her mind racing. She had faced challenges before, but this was uncharted territory. Still, she knew one thing for certain. She would not back down. Roger Whitman's reign of arrogance and cruelty was coming to an end, and she would ensure it was a lesson he would never forget. The trap tightens. The tension at Memorial Hospital was palpable. The whispers about Roger Whitman's suspension had grown louder, fueled by speculation about the investigation into his conduct. Yet, amidst the brewing storm, Martha Carter carried herself with quiet strength. She knew Roger was planning something. His ego wouldn't allow him to accept defeat, but she was determined to stay one step ahead. The unexpected discovery. It was mid-afternoon when Ron, the janitor who had become an unlikely ally, approached Martha in the hallway. His usual shy demeanor was replaced with urgency as he clutched a small flash drive in his hand. "Martha," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "I found something." Martha frowned, leading him to an empty break room. "What is it, Ron?" He placed the flash drive on the table between them, his hand trembling slightly. "I was cleaning Dr. Whitman's office earlier, and his laptop was open. He must have stepped out for a moment. I wasn't going to touch it, but—" Ron hesitated, looking into Martha's eyes. "I saw an email he was drafting. It mentioned your husband." Martha's stomach twisted. What did it say? It was vague, but it sounded like he was trying to dig up dirt on Mr. Carter. I couldn't just ignore it, so I copied the draft onto this. Ron tapped the flash drive. I know it's risky, but you need to see this. Martha hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She took the flash drive, her mind racing. Thank you, Ron. I'll handle this. The evidence mounts. Later that evening, Martha sat at her dining table, the flash drive plugged into her laptop. Daniel sat across from her, his expression a mix of concern and determination. As the email loaded on the screen, Martha read it aloud. Subject: Carter investigation. She began, her voice steady but tinged with anger. I've reached out to some contacts who might have information on Daniel Carter's past business dealings. If I can expose any questionable practices, it will weaken Martha's credibility by association. Daniel's jaw tightened. He's grasping at straws. Martha nodded, her expression grim. He knows he can't touch me directly, so he's trying to attack through you. It's despicable. Daniel leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. We need to act quickly. This proves he's not just defensive. He's actively trying to sabotage you. Martha's mind churned. The flash drive was more than just a discovery. It was a weapon. We'll take this to the board, she said firmly. But I want to confront him first. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Are you sure that's wise? He's already desperate. Cornering him might make him more dangerous. I'm sure, Martha replied, her voice resolute. He needs to know that his schemes won't work. And the staff needs to see that he can be held accountable. The confrontation. The next morning, Martha entered the hospital with renewed purpose. She sought out Dr. Evelyn Sanchez, one of the board members who had been instrumental in supporting the investigation. Dr. Sanchez listened intently as Martha explained the situation and presented the flash drive. Her face darkened as she read the email. This crosses a line, she said. I'll call an emergency board meeting immediately. But if you're planning to confront him, I suggest doing so carefully. Martha nodded. I will. With the board meeting scheduled for the afternoon, Martha made her way to Roger's office. She found the door ajar and Roger inside, pacing like a caged animal. His eyes flicked to her as she knocked lightly and stepped in. Nurse Carter, he said, his voice laced with mock politeness. To what do I owe the pleasure? Martha shut the door behind her, her expression calm but unyielding. I wanted to talk to you before the board meeting. Roger smirked, leaning against his desk. Ah, the infamous meeting. Let me guess, you're here to gloat. No, Martha replied evenly. I'm here to tell you that your games are over. Roger's smirk faltered. What are you talking about? Martha held up the flash drive. I know about your email, the one where you tried to dig up dirt on my husband, and I know you've been reaching out to people to smear his name. Roger's eyes narrowed. So what if I have? Your husband owns half this hospital. Don't pretend his influence isn't why you're still here. Martha stepped closer, her voice steady but firm. I'm here because I've earned my place. My husband's position has nothing to do with my competence or integrity. But you've let your arrogance and prejudice blind you. And now, it's caught up to you. Roger straightened, his facade of confidence crumbling. You have no proof. Martha raised an eyebrow. We'll let the board decide that. The boardroom showdown. The emergency board meeting convened that afternoon, with all key members in attendance. Roger entered the room last, his expression guarded. He avoided looking at Martha, who sat beside Daniel, her posture calm and composed. Dr. Sanchez opened the meeting. This session was called to address new evidence that has come to light regarding Dr. Whitman's conduct. She gestured for Martha to speak. Martha stood, her voice steady as she presented the flash drive and explained its contents. The board members listened intently, their expressions growing darker with each passing moment. When she finished, Daniel added, This isn't just an attack on my family. It's an attack on the values this hospital stands for. Dr. Whitman's actions undermine the trust we place in our staff and leadership. Roger stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "You're all letting her manipulate you. She's playing the victim to gain sympathy." Dr. Sanchez held up a hand, silencing him. "Dr. Whitman, this evidence is damning. Coupled with the testimonies we've already received about your behavior, it's clear that your conduct is incompatible with the standards of this hospital." Roger's face turned red, his fists clenching. "You're making a mistake." "No, Dr. Whitman," Daniel said coldly. "You made the mistake, and now you're facing the consequences." The board deliberated briefly before reaching a unanimous decision. Roger's employment was terminated, effective immediately. His medical license would also be reported for review by the state medical board. The aftermath. As Roger stormed out of the boardroom, the tension that had gripped the hospital for months seemed to dissipate. Word of his dismissal spread quickly, and for the first time in years, the staff felt a sense of justice. Martha returned to her duties, her head held high. She hadn't just fought for herself, she had fought for every nurse, doctor, and staff member who deserved to work in an environment of respect and dignity. That evening, as she and Daniel sat together on their porch, watching the sunset, he took her hand in his. "You did it," he said softly. "You stood up to him, and you won." Martha smiled, her heart full. "It wasn't just about winning," she said. "It was about showing that people like him can't go unchecked. And it was about reminding everyone that strength doesn't come from power, it comes from integrity." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Martha felt a deep sense of peace. She knew there would be more battles ahead, but for now she could rest, knowing she had made a difference. The final unraveling. The hospital buzzed as news of Roger Whitman's termination spread. His departure wasn't a quiet exit. He had stormed through the hallways after the board's decision, his anger barely concealed as he barked orders to his assistant to pack his things. The staff watched from a distance, their expressions a mix of relief and vindication. Roger had long been a thorn in their side, and now, for the first time, there was a sense of justice in the air, a vindictive plan. In the dim light of his office, Roger furiously typed an email on his personal laptop. His anger had not subsided, and his humiliation only fueled his desire for revenge. Losing his position at Memorial Hospital was a blow he couldn't accept. His pride demanded retribution. "They think they've won," he muttered to himself, his fingers pounding the keys. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." Roger's plan was simple. If he couldn't damage Martha directly, he would tarnish the reputation of the hospital itself. He had spent years cultivating relationships with influential people in the medical community, contacts who could spin a narrative in his favor. If he could make it seem like his dismissal was politically motivated or the result of internal corruption, he could salvage his career while casting doubt on the hospital's integrity. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Let's see how they handle this." Martha's guarded triumph. Martha felt a cautious sense of relief as she moved through the hospital corridors. The decision to terminate Roger had been a victory, but she knew it wasn't the end of the story. People like Roger didn't disappear quietly. His ego wouldn't allow it. As she walked into the nurses' station, she was greeted by Lily and Frank, the nurses who had supported her throughout the ordeal. "Congratulations, Martha," Lily said with a warm smile. "You've done what so many of us thought was impossible." Martha nodded, her gratitude evident. "It wasn't just me. Everyone who spoke up made this happen. We proved that we're stronger together." Frank leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "Don't let your guard down. He's the kind of man who doesn't let things go. If he comes after you, we'll be here." Martha placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Thank you. I won't forget that." Roger's final gambit. True to Frank's warning, Roger wasn't finished. Within days, rumors began to circulate in the wider medical community. Anonymous emails and whispered accusations hinted at misconduct at Memorial Hospital, ranging from nepotism to financial mismanagement. The hospital's leadership was accused of targeting Roger unfairly, painting him as a scapegoat for internal politics. The rumors reached the ears of the hospital board, and an emergency meeting was called to address the situation. Dr. Evelyn Sanchez, who had been instrumental in Roger's removal, approached Martha with the news. "We've received word that someone, likely Roger, is spreading damaging rumors about the hospital," Evelyn said, her tone grave. "He's trying to undermine our credibility." Martha's brow furrowed. "Do we have proof that it's him?" "Not yet," Evelyn admitted, "but we're working on it. In the meantime, we need to protect the hospital's reputation." Martha nodded, her resolve hardening. "If he wants to play dirty, we'll be ready." The truth revealed. That evening, Daniel received a phone call from an old acquaintance, one of the influential figures Roger had contacted. The man, a respected surgeon, had been approached by Roger to lend credibility to his accusations against Memorial Hospital. However, instead of supporting Roger, he chose to warn Daniel. "Daniel, I thought you should know," the man said. "Roger's been trying to drum up support for his story. He's claiming you used your position to get your wife involved in board decisions. He's painting himself as a victim." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Thank you for letting me know. We'll handle this." When Daniel relayed the information to Martha, she wasn't surprised. "He's desperate," she said, "but desperation makes people dangerous. We need to stay ahead of him." A counterstrike. Martha and Daniel decided to act swiftly. With the support of Dr. Sanchez and the hospital board, they began gathering evidence to expose Roger's smear campaign. They collected testimonies from staff members, copies of emails, and statements from external contacts who had been approached by Roger. In a decisive move, Daniel called a press conference to address the rumors directly. Standing alongside Martha and Dr. Sanchez, he spoke with calm authority. "We are aware of the accusations being made against Memorial Hospital," Daniel began. "These claims are baseless and part of a deliberate attempt to damage our reputation. We have evidence of the source of these rumors, and we will take legal action if necessary." Martha stepped forward, her voice steady. "This hospital stands for integrity, respect, and excellence. We will not allow the actions of one disgruntled individual to overshadow the dedication of our staff or the trust of our community." The press conference was a resounding success. The hospital's transparency and unity won the support of the public, and the smear campaign began to unravel. Those who had been swayed by Roger's narrative quickly distanced themselves as the truth came to light. Roger's downfall. For Roger, the fallout was swift and brutal. His attempts to salvage his reputation only deepened his isolation. The medical community, once willing to overlook his arrogance in favor of his skill, now saw him for what he truly was, a man consumed by his ego, willing to destroy others to protect himself. Facing potential lawsuits and the loss of his medical license, Roger retreated into obscurity. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of unchecked arrogance and prejudice. A new beginning. With Roger gone and the hospital's reputation intact, Memorial Hospital entered a new chapter. The staff, inspired by Martha's courage, began to foster a culture of greater accountability and mutual respect. One evening, as Martha and Daniel sat together at home, reflecting on the events of the past weeks, Daniel turned to her with a smile. "You didn't just fight for yourself, Martha," he said. "You fought for everyone in that hospital. And you won." Martha nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It wasn't just about winning. It was about showing people that standing up for what's right matters, and that no one, no matter how powerful, should be above accountability." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over their home, Martha felt a deep sense of peace. She had faced the storm and emerged stronger, her integrity unshaken. And in doing so, she had not only changed her own life, but also the lives of everyone who called Memorial Hospital their second home. The ripple effect. The air in Memorial Hospital felt lighter in the days following Roger Whitman's downfall. The toxic presence that had once loomed over the staff had been removed, leaving space for healing and growth. But for Martha Carter, The aftermath of standing up to a powerful adversary was not without its challenges. Though Roger was gone, his actions had left scars on the hospital's reputation and on those who had borne the brunt of his arrogance. The unexpected challenges. As Martha walked through the hospital halls, she noticed subtle changes. Colleagues who once exchanged only polite greetings now offered warm smiles and words of encouragement. Yet not everyone was pleased with the way things had unfolded. A handful of Roger's former allies, doctors who had benefited from his influence, harbored resentment toward Martha for what they perceived as a public takedown of one of their own. In a meeting with the nursing staff, Martha addressed these lingering tensions. The room was packed with nurses of all ranks, their expressions a mix of hope and apprehension. "We've been through a lot as a team," Martha began, her voice calm but firm. "The events of the past weeks have shown us what we can accomplish when we stand together. But they've also revealed the cracks in our system. If we want to move forward, we need to rebuild trust, not just among ourselves, but across the entire hospital." Lily, the young nurse who had supported Martha during the ordeal, raised her hand. "Martha, what do we do about the doctors who still think Roger was right? Some of them treat us like we're the problem now." Martha nodded, acknowledging the concern. "We address it head-on. We continue to show them, through our professionalism and dedication, that respect and collaboration aren't negotiable. Change takes time, but it starts with us. Rebuilding a culture." One of Martha's first initiatives was to organize a series of workshops aimed at improving teamwork and communication between departments. She worked closely with Dr. Evelyn Sanchez and other supportive board members to design sessions that encouraged open dialogue and mutual understanding. The first workshop was held in a large conference room, where nurses, doctors, and administrative staff gathered. The atmosphere was tense at first, with many unsure of what to expect. Martha stood at the front of the room, her calm presence commanding attention. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "We're here to talk about how we can work better together, not as separate roles or departments, but as a unified team. Our patients depend on us to set aside our differences and focus on what truly matters: their care." The session began with an exercise where participants shared their perspectives on the challenges they faced in their roles. A young resident spoke about the pressure to perform under senior doctors who expected perfection. A seasoned nurse described the frustration of having her expertise dismissed in critical situations. Slowly, walls began to come down, and the room filled with honest conversations. By the end of the workshop, the mood had shifted. People who had entered the room as skeptics left with a renewed sense of purpose. Martha's efforts had planted seeds of change, and though there was still work to be done, progress was evident. The personal cost. Amid the hospital's recovery, Martha found herself grappling with the personal toll of the ordeal. Her composure in public masked the emotional weight she carried in private. The memories of Roger's slap and his attempts to discredit her lingered, resurfacing in quiet moments when she least expected them. One evening, as she sat on the porch with Daniel, she finally allowed herself to be vulnerable. "It's strange," she said, staring out at the darkening sky. "We won, but I still feel unsettled, like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop." Daniel reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "It's natural to feel that way," he said gently. "What you went through wasn't easy, but you didn't just fight for yourself, Martha. You fought for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly. And you've made a lasting difference." Martha turned to him, her eyes glistening. "I couldn't have done it without you. Your support kept me strong." Daniel smiled. "Always." Roger's last attempt. Unbeknownst to Martha and the hospital, Roger had not given up entirely. Though his career was in shambles, his bitterness drove him to make one final attempt at revenge. Using a fake identity, he contacted a local journalist, claiming to have information about unethical practices at Memorial Hospital. The journalist, intrigued but cautious, arranged a meeting with Roger at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Roger, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, arrived with a folder of fabricated documents designed to paint Martha and Daniel as corrupt. "This story could be your big break," Roger said, his voice low. "Expose them for what they really are." The journalist flicked through the documents, their skepticism growing with each page. "These are serious allegations," they said, "but your evidence is thin. Why are you coming forward now?" Roger's jaw tightened. "I have nothing to gain from this. I just want the truth to come out." The journalist leaned back, studying him. "You mean you have nothing left to lose?" Roger's face darkened, but he said nothing. Sensing the truth, the journalist stood, leaving the folder on the table. "I'm not interested in running a story based on revenge. Good luck, Dr. Whitman." As the journalist walked away, Roger's shoulders slumped. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his isolation. His schemes had failed, and the world had moved on without him. A ripple of change. Back at Memorial Hospital, the impact of Martha's leadership was becoming evident. Staff members who had once worked in silos now collaborated more freely. Complaints about dismissive attitudes and poor communication decreased, replaced by a renewed focus on patient care. One day, as Martha was making her rounds, she was stopped by a young resident. "Nurse Carter," he said, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to thank you. The changes you've made, they've made a real difference. I used to feel like I couldn't speak up during surgeries, but now I feel heard." Martha smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That means a lot. Remember, it's not about who has the loudest voice. It's about working together to do what's best for the patient." A new chapter. Months later, the hospital celebrated its annual staff appreciation event. The mood was light, with laughter and camaraderie filling the room. Martha was honored with a special award for her contributions to fostering a positive work environment. As she stood at the podium, accepting the award, she looked out at the crowd of familiar faces. "This isn't just my award," she said. "It belongs to all of us. Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens when we come together and stand for what's right. I'm proud to be part of this team." The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the halls of a hospital that had weathered a storm and come out stronger. For Martha, the journey had been arduous, but it had also been transformative. She had faced injustice and fought back, not with anger, but with determination and integrity. And in doing so, she had not only changed her workplace, but also inspired a community to believe in the power of standing up for what is right. A legacy of courage. Months passed, and the shadow of Roger Whitman's influence had all but faded from Memorial Hospital. The institution had undergone a transformation, its culture reshaped by the courage of Martha Carter and the staff who had rallied behind her. But the journey was far from over. For Martha, the true measure of success lay not just in what had been achieved, but in ensuring that these changes endured for years to come. A hospital reborn. The halls of Memorial Hospital, once tense with unspoken divisions, now thrummed with a newfound sense of collaboration. Nurses and doctors exchanged ideas more freely, junior staff felt empowered to contribute, and a sense of mutual respect permeated every interaction. The workshops Martha had initiated continued to bring staff together, fostering the unity that had been missing for far too long. Martha's efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. Dr. Evelyn Sanchez, a key ally throughout the ordeal, approached Martha one morning as she reviewed patient charts. "Martha," Evelyn began, her tone warm, "I wanted to talk to you about something important." Martha looked up, curious. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Evelyn smiled. "The board has been discussing your contributions to the hospital, and we believe your leadership deserves a formal role. We'd like to offer you the position of Chief Nursing Officer." Martha's breath caught. The CNO position was one of the highest-ranking roles in the nursing department, a position that would allow her to shape hospital policies and advocate for staff on a larger scale. "I'm honored," Martha said after a moment, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I need to think about it. This is a big responsibility." Evelyn nodded, her respect for Martha evident. Take your time. Just know that we all believe in you. An unfinished story. As Martha considered the offer, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. Memories of Roger's disdainful words and the sting of his slap came flooding back, but they were tempered by the triumphs that had followed. She thought of Ron, the janitor who had risked his job to expose Roger's schemes, and Lily, the young nurse who had found her voice. These were the people who had inspired her to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced. One evening, as she sat with Daniel on their porch, she shared her thoughts. "They've offered me the chief nursing officer position," she said quietly, watching the stars twinkle above. Daniel's face broke into a proud smile. "That's incredible, Martha. You've earned this." Martha nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. "It's an opportunity to make a real difference, but it's also a lot of responsibility. I don't want to let anyone down." "You won't," Daniel said firmly. "You've already proven that you're willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's the kind of leadership this hospital needs." The return of a familiar face. Just as Martha was beginning to settle into her decision, an unexpected development jolted her out of her routine. During a morning staff meeting, she noticed a new name on the schedule for a series of specialized surgeries. Dr. Arthur Lindell. The name was unfamiliar to most, but Martha recognized it immediately. Arthur Lindell had been one of Roger Whitman's closest allies during his time at Memorial Hospital. Though he had never been as overtly confrontational as Roger, his subtle favoritism and dismissive attitude toward nurses had made him another symbol of the hierarchy that had plagued the hospital. Martha's stomach tightened. She knew his return could threaten the progress they had made. Determined not to let history repeat itself, she decided to address the situation directly. A meeting of minds. The next day, Martha arranged a meeting with Dr. Lindell in her office. She greeted him with professional courtesy, though her resolve was evident. "Dr. Lindell," she began, "thank you for meeting with me. I wanted to discuss your upcoming role at Memorial Hospital." Arthur leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Of course, Nurse Carter. What can I do for you?" Martha chose her words carefully. "As you know, this hospital has undergone significant changes in the past few months. We've worked hard to create an environment where every member of the staff feels valued and respected. I want to ensure that your transition here aligns with those principles." Arthur's lips twitched in what might have been a smirk. "I see. And do you have concerns about my ability to work within this new culture?" Martha met his gaze evenly. "I have concerns about maintaining the progress we've made. I believe in open communication and collaboration, and I expect the same from everyone on this team, regardless of their position." Arthur's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Understood." As he left her office, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a new challenge, but she reminded herself that she wasn't alone. The staff had proven their willingness to stand together, and she knew they would do so again if needed. A legacy of courage. Weeks later, Martha officially accepted the chief nursing officer position. Her promotion was met with widespread support from the staff, many of whom saw her as a symbol of resilience and integrity. During her first meeting as CNO, she addressed the assembled team with her signature calm authority. "This hospital is more than just a building," she said. "It's a community, a place where we care for others and for each other. I'm committed to ensuring that every voice is heard, every contribution valued, and every patient receives the best care possible. Together, we can continue to build something extraordinary." The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. Martha felt a swell of pride, not just in her own accomplishments, but in the collective strength of the people she now led. The future beckons. As the months turned into years, Memorial Hospital continued to thrive under Martha's leadership. The lessons learned from Roger's downfall became part of the hospital's DNA, a reminder of the importance of accountability and respect. Martha's story inspired others beyond the hospital walls. She was invited to speak at conferences and workshops, where she shared her experiences and emphasized the power of standing up for what's right. Her words resonated with audiences, many of whom faced similar struggles in their own workplaces. One day, as she walked through the hospital's bustling halls, she paused to watch a group of young nurses discussing a patient case with a resident. Their interaction was collaborative and respectful, a testament to the culture she had helped create. Martha smiled to herself. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every step. She knew there would always be challenges, but she also knew that together they could overcome them. As she continued down the hallway, the sun streaming through the windows, Martha felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her fight for justice had become more than a personal victory. It had become a legacy.